Hello, I'm Andrew Kelly from Bristol Ideas. In our work on future cities and regions, we look at what makes a place, where it has come from, and where it might go in the future. I'm joined today by Alex Niven to discuss these issues in relation to the north of England. Alex grew up in Northumberland. After leaving the northeast in 2003, he has lived in Moscow, Bristol, Oxford, Manchester, New York, and London before returning to live in Newcastle upon Tyne in 2015. His books include Folk Opposition and New Model Ireland, and he has written for The Guardian, New York Times, Tribune, and New Statesman. He's currently a lecturer in English literature at Newcastle University. His latest book, which we're talking about today, is The North Will Rise Again, In Search of the Future in Northern Heartlands. Alex, thanks for joining me today.
Thanks for having me, Andrew. Very pleased to be here.
I should say from the start that I've spent a lot of time in the North. I was 13 years in Bradford, where I was a student and then an academic at the university. And I also spent time working in Liverpool and Huddersfield, though since 1993, I've worked mostly in Bristol. Your book brings together memoir, history, culture, and political analysis in what you call a cultural and imaginative life of the North. Can we start with you defining the North in geographical terms, as you do in the book?
Yes, this is often the first question that people ask. It's in a sense quite a difficult question, but I think it's absolutely fair to ask that of me. I mean, I think there are certain areas of the North that are kind of unequivocally classically northern. I think the historic counties of Northumberland, County Durham, Yorkshire, Lancashire, probably Cheshire. There's not much debate that they're part of the North. There is a lot more debate about the kind of borderland, as I call it, slightly below that. Lots of people in Stoke, Nottingham, Derby, I think would feel quite conflicted. Lots of people in those cities and the attached counties would say they're part of the Midlands. Nonetheless, I think in some senses they're sort of culturally northern. Stoke had a Northern Soul nightclub, for example. Yes. Bits of Derbyshire, particularly High Peak, for example, seem, part of a kind of northern landscape. So in my book, I go for a definition which revives the old medieval phrase, England north of the Trent. So there's a kind of medieval administrative classification which says that north of the Trent is a kind of different world, a different country. So very loosely, that's the definition I go with. Although I think if it came to kind of putting that into practice in various administrative contexts, you'd have to be a bit more careful. But I think culturally, for me, that is a kind of broader North.
When you look at the Southwest, for example, it's even more difficult, I think, to define as a whole when it runs from effectively Swindon right down to Cornwall. And these are kind of arbitrary structures sometimes placed on us by national government. I think what's really different about your book is what you've referred to there, which is about the way you've talked about the culture of the place and how it links it all together in a way.
Yeah, I mean, partly that's because that's my kind of background and day job. I'm a literature lecturer, as you mentioned in the introduction, and I've spent time as a practitioner of music and poetry. So that's the perspective that I come at things from. I'm not a governance expert. I think it's important to, or thought it was important in writing the book, to sort of glance at those contexts. But as you say, it's sort of driven by culture. I think in a sense, for a kind of long book, that's really all you can do. I think it would be quite difficult to get a kind of 300-page book out of, demarcating a kind of future northern polity that doesn't exist. I think all you can really do if you're looking at things in that kind of broad and deep way is to sort of delve back into history and look at various kind of examples of imagined communities. Obviously, in Benedict Anderson's phrase, we have this notion of place being defined by various imagined communities. whatever the kind of, as you say, sometimes quite arbitrary structures the politicians and civic organizers put over those communities.
When you delve back into history, as you do in the book, you write about the great period of the Industrial Revolution, and the North was paramount, really, a great period of intellectual and scientific discovery. What made it work then, do you think? Why did the North lead the way in this period?
Yeah, I mean, I think the Industrial Revolution is really the key fact in the North's history, and it's really the central event that gives the North its identity and means that the North does feel like a kind of separate country of sorts. That's very much the argument I proceed from in the book. I don't think that would have been the case without the Industrial Revolution. I mean, obviously there are various factors. The growth of the port cities, Liverpool and Newcastle. The proximity of coal, and so on and so forth. I mean, clearly, along with the fact of the kind of foundational creation moment of the Industrial Revolution in the North's history, obviously we're sort of now dealing with the aftermath of deindustrialisation. And I think, it's in a sense quite straightforward. Those are the sort of two facts in the North's history. The sense in which the Industrial Revolution kind of upended the power dynamic of the country, such that the North went from being this kind of wilderness. England north of the Trent was a kind of a place of sort of outlaws and very, very low level development, to being the kind of powerhouse of this sort of global empire. Obviously, that came along with lots of profound moral ambiguities, to put it mildly. But that is really what created the North as a kind of as an imagined community in the modern period. Similarly, as I say, deindustrialization and its aftermath, has kind of is still the kind of shadow that hangs over the North in the 21st century.
When did the North start to go into decline, would you say?
I mean, well, the account of deindustrialization often begins in the very early 20th century. Really, from about the time of the First World War, you have a kind of peak in the Edwardian period, and then from the First World War onwards, you're talking about kind of successive waves of decline, essentially, for the North, which it hasn't really moved out of. I think we can talk about certain kind of flashpoints or kind of moments of acceleration. So obviously the 30s, the time of the mass unemployment, the Great Depression, the Jarrow March being a kind of key sort of narrative moment in the North's experience of that period. I mean, obviously the 80s is another flashpoint, but really the North was kind of declining again from the Second World War. The 80s was really just a kind of falling off a cliff edge moment after the North had already been struggling to replace its economic base. And as I say, we despite the kind of regeneration schemes of kind of 80s, 90s onwards, there's been no really successful attempt to replace the North's economy after heavy and light industries were removed.
My father grew up in Newcastle and grew up. He was a young man in the 1930s before he served in the Second World War, and he often talked to me about the Depression and what had happened to the place then. But he still retained this incredible pride about the Northeast, about Newcastle particularly, and it was often for him seen through the football team, which we'll come back to later on, I think, in the discussion. But in terms of that, for him, was really important. And post Second World War, he would tour the country following the football team. And it's where he met my mother at a Derby County versus Newcastle match, in fact.
Wow.
But there was this incredible pride but also this incredible poverty as well that he talked about.
Absolutely. I mean that really is would be the kind of emotional binary that I would apply to any sort of analysis of the North's identity, going back into time, but into the present day. There is a tremendous pride, a kind of confidence, I think, which again partly comes from the sort of extraordinary technological and economic energy that you had in the kind of long 19th century, in Newcastle, for example, the steam locomotive, various, advances in, first electrically lit street in the world, et cetera, et cetera. There are similar examples in Manchester of these pioneering inventions. And, all of the kind of culture that comes along with that. I think people still retain a memory of that. People did in the 30s, people still do today. As you say, in Newcastle, it does have this embodiment in the football team. But obviously underlying that, alongside that, as you say, is the reality of this kind of slow downslide and decline from that, that rambunctious, energetic, dynamic Victorian period into a recent history in which those things that the kind of economic base of that has been removed and nothing has taken its place.
Let's move on to culture, because this takes up a very significant part of the book, and it's obviously very important. I mean, there's so many things that we could discuss here, but I wanted to start by culture is something that you've lived, as you mentioned at the start. You've been a musician with your own band, and you've written a lot about it here. What has the culture of, as you've kind of lived it, told you about the North?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think probably the main fact, and this, as you say, applies equally in a sense to the Southwest, is that we have a radically centralized country in all sorts of ways, and culture's no different. So the music industry, for example, is incredibly centralized on London. I mean, I talk in the book about the fact that you have this kind of 80s kind of post-punk independent scene. Obviously, Factory Records in Manchester being the most celebrated example. Among other things, that was an attempt to sort of decentralize the music industry and to create multiple centers in different parts of the country. And you see the positive effects of that from the 80s going into the 90s. Obviously, Bristol being one very notable example of that. But Manchester, Glasgow, Liverpool. The 80s and 90s, a great time actually of kind of regional musical productivity and creativity. I think, unfortunately, since that time, there's been a sort of backslide to London, being kind of 9/10 of the music industry again, and a sort of de-emphasis on these regional centres. Obviously, I think that narrative plays out quite similarly in all of the other cultural industries. In publishing, certainly, 9/10 of the publishing industry is based in London. The media, getting a bit better with different kind of branches of the BBC and ITV and Channel 4 moving to different locations, both in the North and the Midlands and so on. But still, I think that radical centralization of cultural production in this country is, that's really defined my experience of culture, and I think it's not a healthy way for a country and a culture to be shaped.
I mean, we've had in recent times, as you mentioned, the BBC moved some of its work to Salford, and you've had the Channel 4 moving to Leeds and opening up soon a satellite office in Bristol as well. So there has been some welcome changes there, I would say, but perhaps not enough. You've also had this small growth of publishers trying to establish northern offices or offices outside of London. including HarperCollins with Harper North and so on. And you're beginning to see some books being published there. But it is, I'd agree with you, incredibly over-centralized and continues to be so. I want to come back to that, actually. But one thing that in your book, which really struck me, was how the North has been used as this backdrop for works about the future. And you talk particularly about, Aldous Huxley's Brave New World, Zamyatin's great book We, and so on. What made them look to those places for their work, do you think?
Well, yeah, I think in those cases and others, people wanting to, I think there's a sense in which English culture is overshadowed by a kind of conservatism and a kind of pastoralism and a kind of nostalgia for the past for various reasons. I mean, probably ultimately because our governance structures are quite conservative. We still have the House of Lords and an aristocracy and so on and so forth. So that I think that when you have kind of modernist and science fiction and futurist writers and artists trying to imagine a different kind of England, they've often looked to the North for inspiration. I mean, obviously, again, it's the Industrial Revolution and the fact that the kind of great northern cities, but not just the cities. Obviously, the industrial culture of the North stretched. Probably doesn't still stretch, but certainly did stretch into the countryside. And for example, you've got this extraordinary fact of people like Yevgeny Zamyatin really, in writing We, kind of inventing the 20th century dystopian novel, Orwell, Huxley, both probably very influenced by Zamyatin in writing their dystopian novels. And Zamyatin's world was really based on his experiences of working on the shipbuilding sites and the docks in Newcastle in the 1910s. I thought it was also extraordinary that you have Teessides, kind of much maligned and much debated at the moment, actually, providing the inspiration both for Huxley's Brave New World in the late 1920s, and then much later, or slightly later, 50 years or so later, providing inspiration for Ridley Scott's Blade Runner. So, I mean, obviously there was a kind of narrative, I was kind of snatching at these things because they kind of fitted together in terms of the book's narrative quite well. But also I think there is a case for saying, as I say, that, writers, when they're trying to imagine a different version of this country, of how things might be in a slightly alternate universe, as it were, they're often, trying to get outside of the establishment, which obviously, geographically is based in London and the home counties. That's the kind of dominant cultural worldview of this country. They're trying to escape from that world, as people like Huxley did. Huxley, a kind of member of the London establishment, I think, going to Teesside, looking at the ICI factory there, and imagining a different universe, as it were.
I think in any books that I really love about place and about placemaking and about cities and regions and so on, it's those snatches that are used of little bits of history which illuminate a much bigger theme that really stand out for me. And I was very much taken by much of your work where you did that, actually, and particularly what we've just talked about there, but also the post-war period of post-war popular modernism, for example, and the use you made of Basil Bunting's work, for example, in that. Tell us about him and his relationship with the North.
Yeah, I mean, so I wrote a PhD on Basil Bunting and edited his letters, so that it's a subject I know quite well. I should say that lots of the book was written in lockdown, so I didn't really have time to go out and do a kind of travelogue about the North or do lots of fresh research. I, in a sense, had to fall back on the things I already knew about, one of which was Basil Bunting. Basil Bunting, quite an interesting figure. I suppose he fits into this narrative of a modernist poet slightly to the side of the English establishment, a poet who had started writing in the 20s and 30s and had kind of been rejected by various London publishing houses. He was a close friend of Ezra Pound's. I guess a kind of disciple of Pound's, not politically, I should stress, but aesthetically, you know, was very much his poetry, you know, was very much in that kind of high modernist vein. But partly due to these rejections in the 30s by, you know, I guess the kind of literary establishment, he had stopped writing poetry, had various kind of adventures around the time of the Second World War, found himself back in the Northeast where he was born in Newcastle in the 1900s, kind of traveled all over the world, but found his way back to Newcastle in the post-war years. But, you know, didn't have a publisher because there aren't any publishers in the Northeast, or none then, very few even now. And was, you know, resigned, I think, to not writing a line of poetry again. He was sort of dramatically and very fortuitously sort of rediscovered by, I guess, a kind of circle of sort of beat poets in Newcastle in the 60s, became a sort of focal point for a poetry scene oriented around a venue called Morden Tower, an old part of the kind of town walls in Newcastle. Allen Ginsberg came to visit, you know, Ferlinghetti came to visit, various kind of poets, both from within Britain and further afield, particularly North America, came to visit, partly because of Bunting's reputation. And Bunting wrote his masterpiece in the mid-60s as a result of this sort of rediscovery, a poem called Brig Flats, which is a little bit like Eliot's The Wasteland or Four Quartets in form, a kind of short, long modernist poem, as it were. And it's very much a kind of celebration of Northumbrian identity, a kind of Northumbrian epic. Northumbria for Bunting meant the whole of the north. He was kind of backtracking to that kind of Anglo-Saxon definition of Northumbria as the land north of the Humber. Combined, as I say, with this modernist aesthetic, quite a different aesthetic to the sort of pastoral, nostalgic mainstream of English poetry. And Bunting was also quite a fierce and passionate advocate of devolution, essentially. And it's, as people were starting to talk about various ideas relating to devolution in the post-war years, this is a time of, you know, the rise of Scottish nationalism, Welsh nationalism, Cornish nationalism in the Southwest. Bunting was one of the, if not the most prominent cultural advocates of, you know, combining that sense of a kind of cultural north with a sort of political campaign to devolve power to the north.
I mean, others you talk about from this period include people like Richard Hamilton, the artist, and Delia Derbyshire, the musician, and who most of us know through the work of the radiophonic workshop for the BBC and so on. But you have this incredible flowering, don't you, at this time of people like this, and which is linked to activity in the places themselves, isn't it? You mentioned the centre in Newcastle where these poetry readings took place and debates took place, and you had Ginsberg, as you mentioned, arriving at Newcastle Central Station to visit the city and take part in those. You also talk a lot about film, and I wanted to move to Bradford actually for the next point of this. And I was living in Bradford when Rita, Sue and Bob 2 was released, and this was a really significant film for the city. It's quite a controversial film. I watched it again recently. I think it's still a very good film, and certainly summed up Bradford, or parts of Bradford, very well, I thought. But it's also based on a tragic story, isn't it, of Andrea Dunbar?
Yes. Yeah, I mean, Andrea Dunbar, you know, a sort of precocious literary genius, you know, started writing plays as a teenager in Bradford in the late 70s. And then, you know, suddenly, you know, comes to attention in the 80s, sort of climaxing with this production of Rita, Sue and Bob 2 in the sort of late 80s. And then, yeah, very, very tragically, by is it 1990 or 91, is dead of essentially kind of a brain hemorrhage, sort of relating to problems with alcoholism. Yeah, I mean, I think that her narrative comes back to the sort of binary we were talking about earlier of, the North having this tremendous sense of, sort of confidence, precociousness, idealism, but undershot, particularly in the, deindustrializing or post-industrial age, with a sense of kind of failure and fatality and a sense of being doomed almost. You have to be careful in extrapolating those sorts of big themes from the life of a single individual who, in a sense, might just have been unlucky or whatever. But I think certainly when we look at a film like Rita Sue and Bob too, I think we can certainly, combined with Dunbar's life story, there is that interplay again, I think, between, this kind of passionate idealism undershot with a sense of melancholy and tragedy, which perhaps goes deeper into time. Obviously you've got the inheritance in that part of the country of the Brontes. Wuthering Heights would be an obvious historical analogy to draw, and Emily Bronte's life, this, very kind of passionate, fierce, precocious, literary genius, but in other ways quite marginalized and quite kind of doomed in a sense to failure.
When you mentioned earlier about music, and that's always been a very strong point for me as well. And I think of the bands that I listened to when I was growing up, and the Animals, for example. Lindisfarne actually were a really important band for me, and I saw them many times perform, and they always struck me as being at the very heart of the place, really, particularly Newcastle. And I remember seeing a documentary on Alan Hull, which I found both incredibly informative and actually quite moving, actually, about his life and what he was trying to represent in his work. These are really important for you as well, aren't they?
Yeah, I mean, I think there are a couple of contexts. I guess one is the sense, again, the sense that in the social democratic periods, let's say, 1945 to some point in the 80s, with after effects lingering on to perhaps the millennium, the kind of egalitarianism of the political system, which was very far from perfect, nonetheless, it had a sense of trying to guarantee certain forms of egalitarianism through a kind of welfare state and so on. I think that produced that decentered things because it empowered decentered things geographically and took things somewhat away from London and empowered certain regional musical endeavors, as in the case of the Animals, both the Animals and Lindisfarne. So I think obviously you've got the Beatles in Liverpool, the Hollies in Manchester, the Animals in Newcastle, Lindisfarne slightly later. I mean, again, the other context is that sense, and you get that in the Alan Hull BBC documentary that was broadcast, I think, was it a couple of years ago, that Alan Hull, never quite got the recognition he deserved. I mean, that's a familiar story. It's, you get that in all sorts of contexts. It's, often has, a gender dynamic. It's often, kind of female artists that are neglected. I think in Alan Hull's case, there is a kind of a sense in which he was neglected, and this featured in the documentary because he was on the geographical margins of England. And Lindisfarne, yeah, I think unfairly sometimes, even in the Northeast, kind of underestimated and seen as a little bit of a kind of, novelty folk rock band. And I think that fits in with this sort of stereotype about particularly people in the Northeast and particularly people from Newcastle as kind of daft, clownish drinkers. Gaza would be kind of unfortunate confirmation in a sense of this stereotype. But yeah, I think Alan Hull and Lindisfarne, among many others, have in a sense suffered from this stereotype.
Someone in the music industry who has received great recognition is Tony Wilson in Manchester and Factory Records and the Hacienda, and they feature in your work too, don't they?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, mainly as as I said, as an example of an attempt to kind of decenter the music industry, but also the kind of final chapter in the book before the epilogue uses Factory as an example of what I call an acid Northumbrian sensibility. This sense, it's not a question of drugs per se, but a question of a kind of psychedelic, psychically exploratory attempt to imagine different ways of being in this country. I think Factory Records embodied that. It was really about trying to kind of be surreal and playful with certain notions of what art and culture might mean. But as I say, with a sort of political impetus, all of that had a purpose, which was trying to shake up the kind of music industry establishment, again with I think a slightly fatalistic sense that couldn't be done quite successfully, quite fully or successfully. So I think there's a sense in which you sort of fall back on this sense of sort of playfully trying to deconstruct things and destabilize things to the extent that you can. And I think Factory Records definitely did that with its sort of situationist prankery and its whole aesthetic, from Peter Saville's artwork through to the Hacienda, through to the music of Joy Division, New Order, Happy Mondays, Certain Ratio, and so on.
And coming right up to more recent years, when I was working as director of Bristol's bid to be European Capital of Culture, there were two main rivals. I would say Liverpool was one and Newcastle Gateshead were the other. And I remember visiting Newcastle Gateshead a lot for family reasons, but also because I got very interested in all the work that was taking place from the Angel of the North right through to the creation of the Sage, for concerts, the Baltic for contemporary art, and the Millennium Bridge, crossing the river, uniting the two sides of the river. I mean, these were really significant moments for culture, not just in the North, but also, I think, generally for the country, major cultural infrastructure projects happening in that place.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, I think that period, and it's interesting historically because it kind of began actually in the 80s. I'm no fan of Margaret Thatcher and Thatcherism. Nonetheless, the Thatcher governments did actually make various concerted attempts at regeneration and at kind of offsetting, for all that they were kind of, closing all of the mines, for example, in the Northeast, they did put, quite a bit of effort and money actually into regeneration, such that, and this continued in the major years. So a lot of those projects at the quaysides, the regeneration of the quayside begun under Thatcher, then the Baltic and the Sage, Baltic Art Gallery, the Sage Concert Hall, Millennium Bridge were kind of commissioned under John Major. And then, that continued under New Labour. I mean, I think obviously the really kind of awful endpoint to that narrative was 2010, in which you have a kind of conservative or coalition government coming in, which is, at the same time as it's introducing austerity, which has quite a devastating effect on particularly northern cities, is not really, at least Thatcher, as I say, had this kind of countervailing instinct to regenerate alongside the various kind of deconstructions of the northern economy. That just sort of disappeared in the 2010s. I mean, you had the kind of Northern Powerhouse, so-called, but it was very, very, small scale and ineffective. Very little money in those kind of Northern Powerhouse schemes. It has slightly different accents in different parts of the north. So Manchester, for example, really kind of pushed ahead of most of the other northern cities, perhaps with the exception of Leeds, but certainly pushed ahead of Newcastle, which had kind of been on a par in some senses in terms of, as you say, these kind of big blockbuster regeneration schemes in the noughties. But post 2010, Newcastle has had very little regeneration, really extending into the present day.
I mean, that's what I find with regeneration schemes. There's often quite a lot can be devoted, but you need it over a much longer period of time. You consider, for example, the transport infrastructure of this country, which we think we have a problem going from Bristol to London, for example. Well, it's nothing for the problems that you have up in parts of the north, for example, in transport infrastructure. And the whole failure to extend HS2 where it needs to go really is another example of that. On devolution, I mean, when Michael Heseltine was one of the great advocates of devolution. When he spoke in Bristol once, he said, you're basically going to have to park your tanks on the lawn of Whitehall and say you've got no choice but to give us all these powers and so on. And there have been various attempts to do this, most significantly in 2004 in the Northeast with the Regional Assembly, which at one point did have support, from what I understand, but then was heavily lost in a referendum. That was one attempt to overcome the immense centralisation that we have. Why do you think that wasn't seen as a way forward at that time?
Yeah, I mean, I think multiple reasons. I think a big one was that, this is New Labour's sort of second term.
Yeah.
By which point New Labour itself had really run out of its kind of reformist energy. I mean, if you look at the first New Labour term, particularly, 97, 98, actually, there were some quite radical breakthroughs at that time, particularly, I would say in foreign policy, not foreign, I guess it's kind of domestic. I have Northern Irish family, so I think of Northern Ireland as foreign. But you have the Good Friday Agreement, kind of seminal breakthrough. You have the Welsh and Scottish referendums, which obviously would result in the creation of assemblies in Scotland and Wales. With the North East Assembly and the wider movement for regional devolution that came along with that, 2004 is a much later moment. It's, sort of 7 years after the Welsh and Scottish referendums. It's post-Iraq. You've got Tony Blair himself saying he thought this was a stupid idea, kind of leaving it to John Prescott to kind of fight beat the drum for the cause of regional devolution. So I think in that climate, it was very easy for the No campaign, which was spearheaded by a young or younger Dominic Cummings. It was very easy in that climate for them to capitalize on this sense of kind of apathy and cynicism. New Labour not really that. They won another majority in 2005, the year after, but actually, if you look at the figures, quite, with a very low turnout and vote share and share of the vote. It was very easy for them to portray all of this as a white elephant. So that, that was the kind of the PR stunt was, getting this actual inflatable white elephant and putting it in front of various landmarks in the Northeast. So I think really that sense of kind of apathy and cynicism was what won out at the end of the day. I mean, there were various other local factors. People in Teesside were much more dead set against having a Northeast Assembly because it would have been based in Newcastle. I mean, I think there's a wider question, as we've seen in recent years, whether holding referendums about these quite complex questions of governance is the right way to go, because people often, are, quite open about the fact that they don't quite, it's difficult to understand exactly how these things are going to work, which is another instance, I think, in which the notion of white elephant comes into play, because people think, how is this going to work? I'm not quite clear. It perhaps is just going to be another expensive waste of time and money. So I think those were the main reasons. I mean, I think the key thing going forward is that it shouldn't put to bed the case for regional devolution and regional government once and for all. It was, it's getting on for 20 years ago now. I don't think we should just say, that happened. The people spoke. The people have spoken, and that's that. I think, I would be in favor of exploring new and better ways of doing it.
I mean, that's what the book comes on to, isn't it? About creating a brighter, fairer, more empowered future, and to create a better future, and not the kind of bleakness that not the kind of bleak future that sometimes we see facing us. And when it comes to maximizing power for places, I can't see anything but radical maximum devolution to a place. And we've had the growth recently of the combined authorities, and you've got the growing northeast combined authority. How do you see that's working? Do you think that's a way forward?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a real breakthrough, the fact that where the northeast combined authority, as you say, is growing, but because the big thing holding it back was that you had this kind of absurdity in that it was a north of Tyne mayoralty. The Greater Manchester mayoralty is Greater Manchester. Everyone knows where that is. It's an actual, geographical, geopolitical entity. North of Tyne is just, completely made up for the purposes of this mayoralty. It stretches from Northumberland, from Berwick, which is, has a football team which plays in the Scottish League, down to Newcastle, and then stops halfway across the Millennium Bridge or the Tyne Bridge, or whichever bridge you want to pick, and doesn't have jurisdiction over Gateshead, which is, just the same part of the same conurbation. I mean, one of the big things that rules out is control over transport, which is one of the really successful things Andy Burnham has achieved in Manchester, is, positive reforms and regulations put on transport. But yeah, the northeast mayoralty is, I think, just going to be called the northeast mayoralty, and that will enable jurisdiction over transport, which is, as we said earlier, one of the kind of really both actual and symbolic factors in the decline of the north, and perhaps, I don't know in detail, the southwest, areas outside of the southeast, and also the means by which, thinking more positively, that's really where a lot of the weight of reform has to go on, is infrastructure, and particularly the transport system.
And you've had recently things like Gordon Brown's Constitutional Commission, which looks at some of these things. I think the hopes for more devolution are strong, and I think it's going to be at that combined authority area rather than at the city level. Certainly in Bristol, we voted to abolish the post of elected mayor recently, in yet another one of those referenda that we've had to go through as a country. But there's something bigger, isn't there, which you talk about in the book, which is about this almost like this narrative of place, about community, and about what home means, and about building that story about the place. And you've begun to do that in this book, I think. I mean, we're at a much lower level in the west of England, I would say. We talk about trying to create a story for the west of England. But I think you've given us a model which can help us develop that. And you're also not afraid to use terms like liberation, radical, imagination, and utopia as well. You're not afraid to use those terms.
Yeah, I mean, it's partly, I'm in a sense liberated by the fact that I'm not a kind of civil servant or a local councillor. So that holds me back in terms of not being able to really tap into the real kind of pragmatic side of these debates. On the other hand, I think that is the role of, the writer or the artist or whatever, is to try to kind of, point to the ideal and point to, the kind of really fiercely energetic and passionate, imaginative dimension of identity and kind of hopes for the future based around communities and places. Clearly, the reality probably will never, emulate the ideal, but I think it's very important to try to be idealistic about these things, and to try to dig deep in terms of identity and imaginative history and what places mean to people, in order to try to shake things up a bit like, Factory Records was a kind of doomed idealistic enterprise, but it actually had pragmatic effects. There's a kind of pragmatism on the other side of the ideal, I think, that follows from dreaming big.
And when you think about the history you've written about and what still exists, whether that's burgeoning new culture as we see it in the poetry scene, for example, through to revival in football fortunes or whatever, there's things to build on there. And I think what you've done is to give us a view of going beyond what you call the heroic failures, the unfulfilled dreams, in trying to find a new way that the North will rise again. Even if it doesn't rise again fully, we need these kind of books, don't we, and debates and discussions to at least point the way to how we might get there.
Yeah, I think so. I think, as we're saying, I do think you have to think quite radically about these solutions, even if, the reality ends up not being, being a lot more moderate. That's fine. I mean, people, there are lots of moderates out there, trying to thrash things out. As I'm saying, when it comes to a book, a work of imaginative sort of cultural history, I think you have to go big or go home.
Well, Alex Niven's The North Will Rise Again is published by Bloomsbury and is out now. It's highly recommended. Thank you, Alex, for your work and for joining us today.
Thanks so much, Andrew. It's been a pleasure.